National Park Service Arrowhead, Glacier National Park, Glacier National Park Conservancy logo, a special thanks to our funding partners. Tony Incashola, Native America Speaks, Apgar Campground, July 22, 2019. An empty stage appears with interpretive displays posted around the stage. The stage, in front of a lake, is surrounded by trees. Ranger Doug speaks off screen and introduces the speaker.
So I'm going to introduce Mr. Incashola to do his program as a part of our Native American Speaks.
Tony Incashola walks into view, takes the microphone, and begins speaking. Ranger Doug passes the camera as he walks off stage.
Thank you, Doug. You always do a great job of starting us off here, but I'd rather listen to you. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you all for allowing me to be part of your evening this evening. As Doug told you, my name is Tony Incashola. I'm a member of the Salish Kalispel people on the Flathead Reservation. The reservation was called Flathead after a tribe of Salish-speaking people that were further west of here, over in the Oregon Territory. There was a group of Salish-speaking people who did practice the art of flattening heads. When you say flathead, automatically you think very, very big flathead, right? But no, it wasn't as dramatic as it sounds. Using the baby board. You're all familiar with a baby board, right? Baby board, baby cradle is a board that's got a kind of like a pouch in it. They put the baby in there and they strap it up in there. And then the women would carry the baby wherever on a horse, set it up against the tree while she was doing work. It was very handy. So this, the name Flathead that stuck with us was a mistake by some early people that were passing through, early settlers, trappers and traders, who came up through what is known the Bitterroot Valley down there south of Missoula. As they came through there, they encountered our people down there and mistook them for what they called the Flatheads. Before they came here, there was another group that did go further west and did encounter these group of people that practiced the art of flattening their baby's head. And by doing that, and when they went back and they said when they reported that, and this other group that came up got lost and came up north instead of further west, and when they seen the Bitterroot Salish, that's the first thing they thought, these are the Flatheads. And like everything else, that name stuck, and we weren't able to get rid of it. So that's how our reservation got named, Flathead Reservation. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. Confederated Salish consists of, like Doug said, the Salish, the Kalispel, Coeur d'Alenes, Spokanes. Those are the main larger groups of people that are on our reservation. You might hear sometimes in history about the Salish Pend d'Oreille people. The Pend d'Oreille is a misnomer. That's not our name. The French people, French trappers, are the ones that called us Pend d'Oreille. When they came by and passed through here, they ran into my people, the Kalispels, and they noticed that all the people men, women, children, all wore shell earrings. And so because of that, that's the first thing I noticed, they called them pendere. And pendere is a French word that means something hanging from the ear or earring. And that's where that name comes from. And so since then, we've been trying to get rid of that word pendere because that's not who we are. We are the Kalispel. In Salish, it's called Kalispe, people of the Camas. That was who we were, the Bitterroot Salish. The Sedlish called themselves Sedlish because they considered themselves the first people. Most of the tribes considered themselves the first people. They have names for themselves in their own language that says first people. And our Salish people, Seedlish, means first people. And Seedlish became Salish. And the Kalispel, like I said, is people of the Camas, Kalispe. And they extend from here all the way to eastern Washington. Is where the Kalispels, that was their main territory. They traveled up and down the river, what is the Flathead River, and on down to turns into the Ponderay, all the way down that way was their main highway, main traveling route between the people down there and the people up here. They would either ride horses and ride horses back, or ride horses and get a canoe and go back down the river with a canoe. So those people became Ponderay, like I said, is because of the trappers and traders. But my people, we are the most eastern Salish speaking people.
Tony Incashola points to a map on stage. The map depicts the Aboriginal territory of the Salish and Kalispel peoples. The original territory is marked with a blue color, with the rest of the territory being marked in green. The blue takes up a significant portion of the map, showing the size of the original territory.
And I know you can't see this, but this is the Canadian line right up here. There's through here, and this is most of Montana, Idaho, Washington. And the lower Kalispel is just inside eastern Washington, just north of Spokane. And so all of this through here, you can see the blue, the dark blue, is the Aboriginal territory of the Salish Kalispel people. The outer lighter color were areas that were frequented by the Salish and the Kalispel people, but not as often as they did in through here, all the way down to the Yellowstone, up to the Sweetgrass Hills and parts of Canada up in here. That was the Aboriginal territory of my people. And we all know time changes everything. As time changed and more settlers moved from the east, coming west, forced other tribes to move further west. So we had the Blackfeet that were up here.
Tony Incashola points to the northeastern portion of the map, then the middle eastern portion, and then finally the southeastern portion.
The Sioux and the Cheyenne people, they were all forced and moved in what was the Aboriginal territory of the Salish Kalispel people. And when that happened, of course, there was a lot of conflict between the people. There was a lot of fighting going on because of the resources that was very important to the people from the east of the mountains, which is the bison, the buffalo. I call them the buffalo, people call them bison. But the buffalo was a big part of our diet, big part of, because it gave so much, it offered so much, and very little, if any, of the buffalo was not used. Literally everything was used in the buffalo. The horns were used as spoons. They were split in half and they were used as spoons or drinking cups. Later years they were used as holders for gunpowder. And then you have of course the hide was used for rugs, robes. The longer part of the buffalo hair was used for ropes. They were braided and used into ropes. The hooves, literally everything was kept. The bones used as tools, scrapers. I have a list. If you come back again next year, I'll bring that list with me. But I have a whole list of the uses of the buffalo, every part of it. Even the intestine was used, dried and used, cleaned, and that held as storage. The gut bag was also dried and cleaned and used for storage. There was nothing, very little that was not used in the buffalo. So that's why when we freely hunted in this area, and as the other tribes moved into this area, there was a lot of conflict over that.
Tony Incashola points to the middle of the map, marking the middle of the Salish Aboriginal territory.
There had to be some treaties with other people, other tribes, in order to determine where the hunting areas were shared, so there was the conflict would settle down. And this, like I said, this was our territory. And you might be able to see this little orange spot here.
Tony Incashola points to a small portion of the map that has an orange line drawn around it.
That is the current reservation that we have. 1.3 million acres of reservation land consisted of over 20 million acres of Aboriginal territory. A lot of people think that the government gave us this piece. But what it is it's called a reservation for a purpose. It was reserved by our leaders after negotiating to reserve that for the Salish and Kalispel people and the Kootenai people. And they ceded the rest of this land so they could have that piece of land for our people. And we all know the government, time to time, that was when the treaty was signed in 1855 with Governor Stevens. That treaty that was signed was not what was negotiated by, well, the Salish didn't think they were negotiating what they negotiated. They went there, they called Stevens, and Stevens, as he came by, he said, oh, agreed to meet, because the Salish people said, we want to meet with you, because they wanted to negotiate. What they were negotiating, they thought, was peace with other tribes. So to determine where people were going to hunt the buffalo. But as it turned out, the Governor Stevens had a whole different plan. And by the time it was over, this is what was left. So there was 1855 in July was when the treaty was signed. And that fall, In 1855, there was another treaty up there at Judith River. That treaty was for determining the hunting areas between the tribes, the Blackfeet, the Salish, and some of the Crow. So that treaty determined, and the tribes agreed to certain areas that they could go hunt, that they had a right to hunt in it. So the conflicts between the tribes finally settled down. But as I was growing up, our elders have always said that the Salish people, Salish-speaking people, came from one group. It could have been a group the size of this, it could have been larger. And as we grew larger and needed more food, needed more resources, the runners, the Salish, the leaders sent out runners to look for more resources. When the runners got back and reported to the chiefs, to the leaders, the chiefs then, the leaders discussed it and they had a meeting and encouraged people to go to these areas that they found. And that's when this one large group of Salish-speaking people split up. So now today we have the Salish and the Kalispel and some Spokane in this area. West of us, we have the Spokane people in this area, the Coeur d'Alene in Idaho, Kalispel, and then this whole Oregon, Washington, Oregon, and parts of Canada is where the Salish-speaking people now exist. Languages are the true identity of who tribes are. I can speak my language to anybody, people over here, and we can almost understand each other. The sound of the language is the same. But over years, the dialects have changed and differed over the years. And so, even though the language sounds the same, some of the words have changed. So, this whole area is where we exist and we still call home. But before that, we always talk about time. We didn't just arrive here, right? We just didn't become who we are today. There was a gradual change that brought us here. I always like to remind people that who were here before us. Who was here before we were? The animals. The animals were here before us. And according to our stories, passed down from generation to generation from our elders,
Tony Incashola moves over to his second interpretive display, a timeline of the Salish Kalispel people. He points to the very beginning of the timeline.
The creation stories, or some people call them coyote stories. Ever since they can remember, these stories have been shared and talk about the animals that prepared what we have, prepared this land. And if you think about it, I'm sure we all learned something in our lifetime from the animals. We have watched animals store food. We have watched animals do different things and learned from them. We know that if the animals if the squirrels go higher and higher to store their food, we know there's going to be a lot of snow. It's going to be cold. If we watch horses and other animals in their activities and you know there's going to be a change coming. And if you watch bears, if you watch other wild animals with little ones, with cubs, or with small, their babies, and you watch them care for it, and then you think about us, how we care for our children, there's a lot of similarity there. That's because we learned in the past that from them, and our ancestors passed those lessons generation to generation till it got to us today. So there's a lot of things that are out there that we don't notice. Sometimes you hear birds, and by the sound of the birds, there's something going on. It's giving you a warning. And you watch, animals will help each other. They will warn each other of danger. There's a lot of things that we take for granted in our world that we don't seem to pay attention to. We listen and we look too much on the surface here, what we see, and don't think about down here where it was and how we learned.
Tony Incashola again points to the timeline of the Salish Kalispel people Aboriginal history. The timeline spans from the last ice age to present day.
So, and this is one of the timeline that we created from our elders that we learned from. I work for the Confederate Salish Tribes Culture Committee, Salish and Salish and Kalispel Culture Committee. And I've been very fortunate to be working there for a few years now, 44 to be exact, with my elders who have shared their stories, who have told me their stories. So every time I get up and speak in front of people, it's not me. It's those stories that were passed down generations before me, from my ancestors all the way up to now. So those stories that they shared with me goes back to the beginning, what they call the beginning of time. The last ice age during that period is our oldest creation story. And that took place when what they call Lake Missoula was formed, created, and then it went down, the dam broke, and it went, ice jams broke, and it went down towards Oregon. Though that is the last creation story, or oldest creation story that we have. And if you listen to our creation stories, when we tell them, exactly what has taken place has come true. So those other stories that are yet to come is still in our creation stories. So it's almost like a storybook, if you will, a Bible, if you will. Those are all similar, but they're older than what we have today. So for instance, that was about 15,000 years ago when that Lake Missoula happened. And then over 12,500 years ago, the oldest known archaeological site, the young boy that was discovered, was over 12,500 years ago. So we know that at least the people were here 12,500 years ago. And that was the baby that was found was right in the Aboriginal territory of the Salish speaking people up in this area.
Tony Incashola points to the southeastern portion of the map, then turns to the timeline.
So this timeline kind of gives you an idea, and it goes all the way to about 9,000 years ago. The region's climate warms and becomes similar to the seasons of recent centuries. In our creation stories, somewhere along the line, there's a creation story that talks about the battle that was during the Ice Age, the battle of the cold and the warm animals, the birds. Because there's one animal wanted strictly cold all the time, and the other one wanted some warmth, some warm weather. So there was a battle that took place, and they turned out that they finally ended up agreeing to half and half, 6 months of cold, 6 months of warm. So that's kind of similar to some of the things that took place at the turn of the last ice age. 4,000 years ago, the Salish population increased. And the people that there was, at one time, the people said there was at least between 40 and 60,000 Salish and Kalispel people. And then what happened about that time was when the Spaniards got here and arrived, and smallpox started coming around, and of that 40 to 60,000 people, nearly wiped out the Salish-speaking people in this area from smallpox. We did lose a couple of bands of Salish people. One of them we called the Tuatnachen, who was in this area over here.
The presenter walks back to the map and points to a region which is now eastern Montana.
That were hit by smallpox. When they were hit by smallpox, and there was only maybe 8, 9 camps left, and they moved from there, burnt everything that they had, buried all the people, and moved up north to what is now Browning. That was before people lived in Browning, and they lived there for a while. And then again smallpox. And then they moved back down to where the other Salish people, what is now the reservation, lived. And they stayed there. Again, they were quarantined at that time, and the smallpox hit again, and there was only maybe 3, maybe 4 camps left. And then they continued to come down this way. And as they came down further south and east, they kind of disappeared. The remaining, the survivors, kind of got with some other tribes and became members of those tribes. If you know tribal history, there's a chief they called Washkey down in Wyoming, Chief Washkey. He was a great leader. He was a great chief. And they say that Chief Washkey was one of those last remaining survivors of that band of Salish that disappeared. And as he came through here and became part of the Salish, or the Shoshone people, he became chief. So that was the last known survivor of that. But you know, we've heard about this guy a couple of people named Lewis and Clark that came through in early 1800s. At that, I remember the story told by the elders that as they came up the Bitterroot down south of Missoula, as they were coming up, the Salish people were just getting ready to go east of the mountains to hunt That was in September. They were getting ready to go hunt east of the mountains. And the chiefs always had runners and scouts out. And it so happens that there was some scouts south of them that seen something coming in the distance. And they looked and looked, and at first they didn't know what it was. They looked, and as they got closer, they realized there was some people, very light-colored people. They've never seen white people before. And so they went back and reported to the chief. And the chiefs gathered quickly. They discussed this. They didn't know what to do. What are we going to do? Shall we go out, kill them all, or shall we wait and invite them in? Well, evidently they chose the latter. They invited this group, the Lewis and Clark group, into their camp. They came in, and there was one guy with them that was a different color. They were very fascinated by this different color. First of all, they laid the blankets down. They had these people sit down. They fed them. They gave them some food. They thought they were cold because they were so light colored. They thought they were freezing. So they covered them up with blankets. And then there was this one guy out there. He was dark. He was black. And some of the people would go up and look at him. You know, they'd touch him, rub his face, and look at their hand, and nothing came off. What they were thinking was, in our culture, we have what we call, after the new year in January, we have what we call medicine dances. Medicine dances is a time where all of our medicine men and women who are professionals in different areas would gather and have ceremonies, and they'd heal the people that needed healing. And one of the parts of this ceremony was a blue jay. A blue jay who was very powerful, very strong, very mysterious. And this blue jay, before the ceremonies, would take some of the charcoal from the fire and cover all of his face with the charcoal black, so his face was all black. That's what these people thought this one guy that was with Lewis and Clark was. They thought he was a powerful man because his face was black like a blue jay, like a medicine man. So, but when they rubbed it, it came off. So that was one of the things that they were so fascinated with him, that they just gathered around him. They couldn't speak with him, so couldn't understand each other. But finally somebody, I think, explained that he was just a different race of person, from a different race. Well, anyway, Salish people helped them cross over into Idaho, all over the Lolo Trail. This map here came from our elders, meeting with our elders. These are all place names that our elders gave us. When we were interviewing them, they would mention a place, and we'd write it down on a map. And through this process, we found our Aboriginal territory. Because our elders have always said, if we have a name for it, we use it or we've been there. If we don't, we've never been there. So all of these names are on here are Salish. Talk about Lolo, where I was talking about, is called Tim Simtli. Tim Simtli means no salmon. And that's one of our creation stories. We all know Coyote is a mysterious trickster. Well, Coyote when he came through our land, getting rid of all the what they call the people eaters, one of his jobs was to bring salmon over the pass Lolo into the Bitterroot River to provide salmon for the Bitterroot River. And of course, the coyote being who the coyote never accomplished that. So that's why we don't have salmon in the Bitterroot. It's his fault. I'd tell you the whole story, but in my culture, I can't tell you these creation stories until there's snow on the ground. That's the only time I can tell those. We can tell those stories, is when the snow on the ground and all the hibernating animals are sleeping. You know, when I was younger, I used to ask my grandmother all the time, why? Why can't we tell stories? Because I love those stories and I used to listen. Want her to tell me, but she always said, no, it's not in season. Well, finally I kept bugging her enough that I kept saying, why can't you tell me this stuff? Then finally she said, well, one thing. In wintertime, when the land is covered with snow and the hibernating animals are asleep, it's safe to tell these stories. Because most of the time you're talking about the animals and these creation stories. Well, I said, well, what happened if you tell a story? He said, well, if you tell a story out of season, a snake's going to come up to you. It's going to wrap around your leg. And you don't know what's going to happen. Well, when I was that young, that was enough for me. I never asked her again. But those are some of the beliefs and traditions of my people that we still follow. We still encourage our young people to follow, to understand why. It's out of respect, not only for our ancestors, but also for the animals that we talk about. And besides, throughout the year, everything is busy. From the springtime to the winter months, you're gathering, you're hunting, you're preparing for the winter months. If you don't do that, you're going to be short food or medicine when winter comes. It's not like we can go down to Walmart or somewhere and buy some food. If you didn't get it, you were out. You were out of luck. So that's why I think that winter months, when things settle down and people were in their camps and the elders gathered the young people and started telling, this was an educational time to let them know why, the do's and don'ts of life. Because all of our creation story has a reason, it has a lesson. They're not only interesting stories, but there's a lesson. How chipmunk got its stripes, how certain animals look the way they are. Those are all part of our creation stories. And if you didn't mind then the food, if we didn't continue to hunt, you'd lose out on food. In the springtime, Bitterroot, how many of you know what Bitterroot is? 1, 2. I messed up again. I was going to bring you a jar and show you what Bitterroot is. They're pink flowers when they bloom. That's the state of Montana's state flower, the bitterroot. But the bitterroot has got roots about 6-8 inches. And when it's ready to dig, you can take the roots and it peels so easy, and it's pure white. Once you clean it, you can dry it, and stored properly, it could keep for years. And that's what the people did. So because that's the first food plant ready every spring, we have a ceremony, or what we call a bitterroot feast, at that time, to show and to honor and to respect the return of the bitterroot and what it has done for the people over the years. And during that ceremony, we include all the other medicines and plants for the following year. It's a good harvest and all that. And after that's done, then people couldn't dig for their own families until after the ceremony. Once it's done, then families can go ahead and go dig on their own. I better check my time here. After that, the next important thing is the camas. And camas is a bulb. It's got a purple flower, and the bulb it could vary in size. And it takes 3 days to cook it. And it's a very important part of our diet also. You go out and you dig. They're in wetlands, they're in wet areas. You dig the camas, you clean it, and you let it dry a bit, and then you can cook. It's cooked in a pit, about, depending on how much camas you got, usually 3 feet deep and a round hole. And how they do it is they dig the hole. Oh, the other thing too is, I don't see any. Have you seen those black moss on the trees? That's food. That black moss is food when you cook it right. That was the other thing that we had to get. We got the moss, you washed it and cleaned it, and then my grandmother, I don't want to be biased, but my grandma was the best at it. When she was digging, after she dug the camas, then she'd send us up to get the black moss. We'd go get moss and gather that. We'd have a big sack, gunny sack, we'd put the moss in, fill it up, and bring it to my grandmother, and she'd look at it, take her fist, and push it down. By the time she was done pushing down, it was only about like that, and send us back for more. Well, finally, after we satisfied her, she'd wash it, clean it, and get the camas that she dried. Then she'd tell us, the boys. I was the youngest of 4 brothers. And she'd tell us, okay, this is what I want. The hole, what size. We got the wood. We gathered the rocks. It's usually kind of lava type rocks that you find nothing close from the water, because they split and when they get heated. Anyway, we'd gather the rocks and we'd make fire. Over the hole, we'd put about 4-foot long split logs on top, crisscross, and then we'd put the rocks on top and heat it. We'd light it and heat the rocks. After it all burned and it fell into the hole, she'd continue to let it burn, heat it up, and then when the fire went out, she'd take all the ashes, all the unburnt wood out, and then she would make us get some skunk cabbage. You don't know what skunk. They're big leaves, green leaves that also in wet areas. She would make us dig some of pick some of those. Then she'd put over the rocks in the bottom, she'd put alder branches about, maybe inch and a half or so on top of that, a layer of that. Then a smaller layer of the alder branches. And then on top of that, she would put a layer of the black moss. Then she'd put the camas on top of the moss. Then she'd reverse the process. She'd put the moss, the skunk cabbage, and once she got to that, then the wood up on top. Well, if she got to filled it up, then she'd take a stick and put it right down somewhere in the middle. And then she'd leave that stick there, and then she would cut bark from the trees, usually pine trees. You only cut maybe 2 feet wide and 3 feet long. You didn't want to cut all the way around a tree or it would kill it. But if you cut just pieces of it, the tree would survive, it wouldn't die. So we'd cut all of those and then we'd lay that on top. And then she'd cover it with a layer of dirt. And then, after she got all that finally done, then she'd pull that stick out and pour water down to that hole. And then you can hear the rocks, when the water hit the rocks, you could hear the sound of the rocks and that steam comes out. Then she'd cover the hole. And then she'd make another fire over the top of it. And then she'd say, okay, you boys, get out of here. We weren't allowed to be part of that good process. We did the work, then she'd make us leave. No, she said, why? Why can't we stay? And there's a Salish word, they call it Incashola, which means you're going to ruin it. So we got kicked out of the kitchen, I guess. But after 3 days, every morning she'd go check, because she'd done it for so many years, she knew how big the fire to build. She'd build a fire, okay, then she'd go home. That evening she'd go check again, build another fire. After the 3rd day, then she'd gather us boys up again and say, okay, now come. And we have to start dig it out, dig the camas out. We dug it up, get down to the camas, and then you peel back the skunk cabbage, toast it on there, and all that's left would be a big, solid slab of camas with cooked black moss. That moss would cook and it would melt. It would kind of melt as it was cooked. And then you cut a piece of it, then she'd give us a piece of that, a slice of that. And when you took a bite of that, it tastes like licorice, because that black moss gives it that licorice taste. And the camas would be so good. You could keep camas like anything else. Stored properly, you could keep for years. Hunters, people, the men that went hunting, sometimes would take a handful of that cooked camas and just carry it with them. And whenever they get hungry, they'd eat 1 or 2, and that's all they need because it was so nutritious. That would carry them all day long on their hunt. They wouldn't get hungry. So it was very good. I was thinking about the bitterroot. The bitterroot also, you know, besides being a good food, it was discovered later that it was medicine. that as a steady diet, eating bitterroot thins your blood. So that's why, as they got older, especially the old people, they really liked bitterroot. And I'm getting to that point that I kind of like it too. But when they eat it as a steady diet, they discovered that the scientists discovered that it thins the blood. It's a blood thinner. So that's why some of these people lived forever. So it was a medicine. So a lot of the foods that we have is also doubles as medicine. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I think I'll go ahead and close. I want to thank you again. Remind you of the Aboriginal territory. Each name that we have here has is a self-explanatory. You know, it's a reason.
Tony Incashola points back at the map, emphasizing that each location has a Salish name.
All the names have a, if you want to come up and have an explanation on that. So you might not be able to pronounce the Salish, but Ordlin Seljuk, that's the big belly waters. Schmidshare, that's down in the Bitterroot. It's cottonwoods above the water. Evidently there was water, and then river, all the cottonwoods would come up, grown in the water, and that they called it Schmidshare, which means cottonwoods sticking out of the water. So all the places have names, and all the places that we go to have names. So, and our timeline here goes all the way up to about 1,000 years ago, and all the way down to 15,000 years ago. So, again, thank you for your attention. I hope I shared something that you could take home with you wherever you're from, and think about this evening. Think about what you heard, what you shared, that we are all of one, and one for all. That I think that it's interesting to know that regardless of where we're from, who we are, what our backgrounds are, what our nationalities are, that we all want the same thing in general. And I always say, sometimes our history, our past, some of the history is not very good. But I always say, you can't have a future if you don't have a history. We learn from history. We learn many things from the past to help us build a better future. Not only for ourselves, but especially for our children and other generations. Thank you very much.
Tony Incashola walks off stage and gives Ranger Doug back the microphone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll hope to see you
Next time.
next time.
Tony Incashola and Ranger Doug bump fists as they say goodbye. The screen fades to black, text on screen, presented by Tony Incashola, Doug Follett, filmed by Hannah Schwalbe, edited by Alexander Stilson. Glacier National Park Conservancy logo, a special thanks to our funding partners. National Park Service Arrowhead logo, Glacier National Park.